She was known by many in her small Florida town as a woman who had suffered more than her fair share of hardship. A drifter moving between odd jobs, sometimes sleeping in her car, other times staying in rundown motels. Her name was Aileen Wuornos, and by the late 1980s, her life was a storm of poverty, abuse, and rage simmering just beneath the surface. What no one could have guessed was that she was about to become one of the most infamous female serial killers in American history. Aileen was born in Rochester, Michigan in 1956 to a teenage mother and a father who would later serve time for child molestation before taking his own life in prison. By the age of 4, she and her brother Keith were abandoned by their mother and left in the care of their grandparents. Home was far from safe. Her grandfather was violent and controlling, and Aileen learned early to survive in an environment filled with cruelty. By the time she was 11, she was already exchanging sexual favors for cigarettes and food, a pattern of exploitation that would define her adolescence. At 14, she was pregnant after being raped by a family friend. Her baby was placed for adoption, and within months her grandmother had died and her grandfather had thrown her out of the house. Homeless at 15, Aileen drifted into the world, surviving on sex work, petty crime, and the fleeting connections of strangers. For years, she moved across the country, often arrested for theft, assault, and disorderly conduct. But beneath the instability was a deepening anger, a sense that the world had betrayed her at every turn. That anger would later become deadly. By the mid-1980s, she had settled in Florida, working the highways as a sex worker. It was dangerous work, but she had long stopped believing her life could be anything else. The few people she allowed close described her as volatile, quick to anger, defensive, always ready for a fight. In 1986, she met a woman named Tyria Moore at a Daytona Beach gay bar. Tyria would become the love of her life, her anchor, and her obsession. But their relationship was steeped in poverty and desperation, sustained by Aileen's sex work and fueled by alcohol and volatile arguments. It was in late 1989 that Aileen crossed the line from survival to murder. Her first known victim was Richard Mallory, an electronics store owner who picked her up along a Florida highway. Later, Aileen would claim that Mallory had raped and brutalized her before she shot him in self-defense. But investigators who pieced together the timeline saw something darker. Mallory's body was found riddled with bullets, abandoned in the woods. His car had been stolen, and Aileen and Tyria had used his credit cards in the days after his death. For investigators, it looked less like self-defense and more like calculated murder. But Mallory would not be the last. Over the next year, a string of men were found dead in Florida, each killed with a .22 caliber pistol, each linked back to Aileen through stolen property, credit cards, and eyewitness sightings. There was David Spears, a construction worker whose nude body was found along a highway, shot 6 times. Charles Cascadon, a part-time rodeo worker, was discovered with 9 bullet wounds to his chest and stomach. Troy Barris, a sausage salesman, was reported missing after failing to make his deliveries. His body was found weeks later in the woods, decomposing, with bullet wounds marking his death. Charles Humphreys, a retired Air Force major and child abuse investigator, was found fully clothed, shot multiple times. Then there was Walter Antonio, a trucker, his body discovered in a remote area, shot 4 times. The pattern was chilling. These were not random acts of passion, they were systematic. Each victim was a middle-aged man killed along Florida's highways, his car stolen and belongings pawned off quickly. Aileen and Tyria were often spotted driving the victims' vehicles or attempting to sell their possessions. Witnesses described the pair as being together constantly, inseparable, and investigators soon came to believe Tyria knew far more than she admitted. By the summer of 1990, law enforcement agencies across several counties realized they were hunting the same killer. They released composite sketches of 2 women seen abandoning victims' cars, and the media soon splashed the story across headlines. It was the beginning of Aileen's downfall. In January 1991, police arrested her at a biker bar in Volusia County. Tyria, fearing for her own freedom, agreed to cooperate with investigators. In exchange for immunity, she called Aileen while wired, gently coaxing her into confessing. On the recordings, Aileen can be heard admitting to the killings, claiming she had been forced to kill men who tried to rape her, but prosecutors argued the pattern was too consistent, too calculated to be explained as repeated self-defense. The trial of Aileen Wuornos in 1992 became a national spectacle. The prosecution painted her as a cold-blooded predator, a woman who lured men with the promise of sex and then executed them in cold blood for profit. The defense argued she was a victim of lifelong abuse, a woman who had been brutalized by men since childhood and had snapped in fear and rage. But the jury was unmoved. She was convicted of 6 murders and sentenced to death. As the years passed on death row, Aileen gave numerous interviews. Sometimes she raged against the system, accusing guards of abusing her and claiming she was tortured in prison. Other times, she seemed resigned, telling interviewers she wanted to die, that life had been nothing but suffering. In 2002, at the age of 46, Aileen was executed by lethal injection at Florida State Prison. Her final words were cryptic and strange, promising she would return with Jesus and the spaceship on Judgment Day. The case of Aileen Wuornos continues to haunt criminologists and the public alike. Was she a predator who killed for gain, or was she, as she insisted, a victim fighting back against men who sought to harm her? The truth is buried in the violent chaos of her life. What remains undeniable is the legacy she left, a chilling reminder that evil is not confined to a single gender, and that the cycle of abuse and violence can twist a human being into something unrecognizable. In the quiet towns along Florida's highways where her victims once lived and worked, the memory of her crimes lingers. Families left behind still carry the grief of loved ones lost, and those who study the darkest corners of human behavior continue to wrestle with the chilling figure of Aileen Wuornos, the woman who became one of history's most infamous female serial killers. She was once regarded as a beautiful Hungarian noblewoman, a woman of wealth and status who lived in a castle with hundreds of servants at her command. But beneath the surface of privilege and power, Elizabeth Báthory carried a darkness so profound that centuries later, her name would be remembered with horror. History calls her the Blood Countess, a woman whose cruelty toward young girls became legendary and whose crimes blurred the line between fact and nightmare. Born in 1560 into one of the most powerful Protestant families in Hungary, Elizabeth was surrounded by wealth from the very beginning. She was married at the age of 15 to Count Ferenc Nadasdy, a military commander who spent much of his time away at war. While her husband was away, Elizabeth managed their vast estates, overseeing peasants' finances and the daily life of the castle to the outside world. She seemed intelligent and capable, even progressive. She could read and write in several languages and was known for her education in a time when many women were denied it. But those closest to her began to whisper about her temper, her cruelty, and her fascination with pain. The first stories of her violence began quietly. Servants described sudden, inexplicable rages. A maid who failed to sew properly might be struck until her fingers bled. A girl who moved too slowly could be beaten with whips until she collapsed. Some witnesses later claimed Elizabeth took pleasure in biting her servants, tearing their flesh with her teeth. The accounts grew darker still. Young women locked in freezing water during the winter, others burned with hot irons, needles pushed beneath fingernails. But it was not just cruelty. There were rumors of ritual. Legend holds that Elizabeth believed the blood of virgins could preserve her beauty and youth. According to testimony collected later, she bathed in the blood of her victims, though historians continue to debate whether this detail was fact or myth fueled by her infamy. What remains beyond question is that hundreds of girls entered her castles and never returned. Her husband's death in 1604 left Elizabeth with even greater control. She moved between her properties, often accompanied by loyal female servants who aided her in her acts of torture. Together, they lured peasant girls with promises of work or noble training. Some came from the villages surrounding her estate, while others were sent by poorer families, hoping their daughters might secure a better future. Instead, they disappeared into the stone walls of Szejte Castle, their screams echoing through the corridors at night. Suspicion grew. Villagers whispered about the number of funerals, the strange disappearances. Priests were summoned to bless bodies bearing signs of abuse. Yet for years, Elizabeth's power and her noble status shielded her from consequences. After all, she was a countess, tied to the most influential families in Hungary. To accuse her openly was dangerous. It was only when daughters of lesser nobles began to vanish that her crimes could no longer be ignored. The Hungarian king Matthias II ordered an investigation. In 1610, soldiers and officials stormed Szejte Castle. What they found was grotesque. Witnesses later testified that they discovered girls dead, dying, and chained in dungeons. Some were mutilated beyond recognition. Torture chambers revealed instruments of unimaginable cruelty. Testimonies from servants painted a consistent picture. Elizabeth and her closest attendants had tortured and killed scores of girls. The numbers varied wildly. Some accounts claimed 30, others suggested as many as 600 victims. The evidence was overwhelming. Dozens of witnesses, survivors, and accomplices testified to her crimes. Her servants, Ilona Jo, Dorothea Puente, Katarina Benica, and Janos Ujvari, were tried and executed. They confessed to aiding the Countess, describing in detail how girls were beaten, starved, burned, and killed at her command. But Elizabeth herself never faced a public trial. To execute her would have brought scandal to the nobility and shaken the political foundations of Hungary. Instead, she was sentenced quietly, imprisoned within the walls of her own castle. Windows and doors were bricked up, leaving only small openings through which food could be passed. For 4 years, she lived in isolation, cut off from the world she had once controlled. In 1614, she was found dead in her chamber. Her reign of terror finally ended. The aftermath of her crimes lingered long after her death. Villagers spoke of ghosts haunting the castle, of restless spirits seeking vengeance for the horrors they endured. Legends of her blood rituals spread across Europe, feeding the folklore of vampirism. She became a symbol of feminine cruelty, her name invoked alongside monsters. Yet historians debate the extent of the truth. Was Elizabeth Báthory guilty of the atrocities recorded in the testimonies, or was she a victim of political intrigue, her downfall engineered by rivals eager to seize her land and power? What is certain is that too many young women vanished within her walls to dismiss the stories entirely. The testimonies of witnesses, the sheer number of deaths, and the fear she inspired leave little doubt that something deeply evil unfolded in her castle. Whether she killed dozens or hundreds, she remains one of the most terrifying figures in criminal history. Even today, Sejte Castle stands as a ruin, a shadow of its former self, perched on a hill in Slovakia. Tourists who visit speak of a chilling atmosphere, as if the stones themselves hold memories of suffering. Elizabeth Báthory's story endures not just because of its horror, but because it forces us to confront unsettling questions. How could so much evil flourish unnoticed, protected by wealth and privilege? How many victims suffered in silence because the truth was too dangerous to speak aloud? The Blood Countess remains an enigma, part history, part legend, but forever remembered as one of the most evil women to have lived. Her name became synonymous with terror in the Russian city of Rostov-on-Don. To neighbors, Tamara Samsonova seemed eccentric, perhaps even harmless. She was a small, elderly woman, shuffling through the markets, collecting food, feeding stray cats. But behind her modest apartment door lurked a reality so grotesque it shocked the world when it finally came to light. By the time police uncovered her crimes, she would be branded the Granny Ripper, an elderly serial killer who murdered and dismembered those closest to her. Tamara was born in 1947 in Russia, growing up in the shadow of post-war deprivation. Little is known about her early life, but as an adult, she moved to St. Petersburg and lived with her husband. They resided in a small flat, typical of Soviet-era housing, cramped, grey, and devoid of comfort. Over the years, Tamara developed a reputation among acquaintances for being secretive, odd, and withdrawn. She often spoke of her poor health, visited fortune tellers, and carried herself with an air of quiet discontent. In the 2000s, her husband mysteriously disappeared. Tamara filed a missing persons report, but he was never found. Neighbors whispered about his vanishing, but with no body and no evidence, the case went cold. For years after, Tamara lived alone, occasionally renting rooms in her apartment to lodgers The arrangement seemed practical for a woman of limited income, but her tenants also began to disappear. She often explained away their absences with casual remarks. They had moved, they had left without notice, they had returned to family elsewhere. Yet in her diary, which would later become infamous, Tamara kept chilling notes, written in Russian, German, and English. Her entries described in detail how she murdered and dismembered her victims. One entry, for example, recounted how she gave sleeping pills to a tenant before cutting him into pieces in the bathroom. Another described dragging heavy bags of remains to nearby dumpsters under cover of night. The full extent of her crimes came to light in 2015 when the police were called after a woman's torso was found near a pond. The victim was identified as 79-year-old Valentina Ulanova, a neighbor of Tamara's. Investigators soon discovered that Tamara had been staying with Valentina. The two women had quarreled, reportedly over household chores. According to her later confession, Tamara crushed sleeping pills into Valentina's meal. When the older woman fell unconscious, Tamara slit her throat and began the process of cutting her body into pieces. She placed the remains in plastic bags, which she disposed of in different areas. Surveillance cameras captured her carrying the bags in the dead of night, dragging them across the street. When police searched Tamara's home, they found bloodstains, knives, and, most disturbingly, her diary. Page after page revealed accounts of killings stretching back years. Entries hinted at as many as a dozen victims, though authorities have never been able to confirm the exact number. She wrote about one tenant named Volodya, detailing how she drugged him with sleeping pills and dismembered him while he was still alive. Another passage described boiling flesh from bones and scattering remains in different locations. Her words were chillingly matter-of-fact, devoid of emotion, as though she were documenting routine tasks rather than heinous crimes. The discovery of the diary horrified investigators. This was not an impulsive act of rage, but the record of a serial predator who had lived undetected for years. In court, Tamara appeared calm, even detached. She admitted to killing Valentina, and when pressed about other victims, she offered cryptic statements. At one point, she told the judge she deserved to die. At another, she smiled and waved to the cameras as if enjoying the notoriety. Experts who examined her suggested she suffered from schizophrenia or other severe mental illness. Yet her writings and actions also displayed a chilling awareness of her crimes. Ultimately, Tamara Samsonova was declared unfit for a traditional prison sentence. In 2016, she was committed to a psychiatric facility where she remains to this day. Though officially convicted of only one murder, the evidence suggests she killed many more, perhaps spanning decades. The horror of her case lies not only in the violence itself, but in the image it shattered. We are conditioned to see elderly women as harmless, nurturing, fragile. Tamara exploited that perception, hiding in plain sight, carrying bags of dismembered bodies past unsuspecting neighbors. To the community, she was the quiet old woman who fed stray cats. In reality, she was disposing of human remains in dumpsters and ponds. Her diary remains one of the most disturbing artifacts in modern criminal history, a written confession of atrocities blending the mundane with the monstrous. In it, She described shopping for groceries and preparing meals alongside descriptions of slicing bodies into pieces. The casual mixing of normal life with calculated murder is what makes her words so terrifying. The case of the Granny Ripper leaves behind a disturbing reflection. Evil is not always youthful, obvious, or easy to detect. It can wear the mask of age, of frailty, even of grandmotherly kindness. For the families of her victims, closure is impossible. With so many disappearances left unexplained and so many bodies never recovered, the true scope of her crimes may never be known. In St. Petersburg, the apartment where she lived still stands indistinguishable from the thousands of identical grey buildings in the city. To passers-by, it is just another aging structure, but for those who know the story, it represents a chilling reminder of how horror can exist in the most ordinary places, hidden behind closed doors, carried out by the most unlikely hands. In the southern Indian state of Kerala, whispers of a woman who poisoned her way through her own family spread like wildfire. In 2019, her name was Jolly Joseph, and though she projected the image of a devoted wife, mother, and neighbor, behind her pleasant smile and church-going respectability lay a methodical killer who eliminated anyone who stood in her way. What began as a single suspicious death would unravel into one of the most disturbing serial murder cases India had ever seen. Jolly was born in 1972 and, by all outward appearances, lived a modest but ordinary life. She married into the wealthy Ponnamatam family in Kudathai, a village in Kerala's Kozhikode district. For years, she was seen as a loyal daughter-in-law, quietly managing the household, caring for her children, and playing the role of a dutiful wife. Neighbors described her as polite, well-mannered, and deeply involved in community and church activities. But beneath the mask of normalcy, she carried ambitions that far exceeded her means and a ruthless streak that no one could imagine. The first death occurred in 2002 when Jolly's mother-in-law, Anama, collapsed and died suddenly after a meal. It was attributed at the time to a heart attack. No one questioned it. Anama was elderly, and her passing seemed natural. But 3 years later, in 2005, Jolly's father-in-law, Tom, died in a similar fashion. Again, it was assumed to be a natural death, though family members noticed how calm Jolly appeared during the mourning period. Then, in 2011, tragedy struck again. Jolly's husband, Roy, collapsed and died at the family home. Once more, the cause was listed as cardiac arrest, but Roy's sudden death raised more questions. His drinking habits had been moderate, his health relatively stable. Some relatives began to suspect something darker, but Jolly quickly took control of the narrative, presenting herself as the grieving widow. Within months, she had moved into a position of authority in the family, managing finances and property, yet death followed her like a shadow. In 2014, Roy's uncle Matthew died unexpectedly. In 2016, a cousin named Alphine, just a toddler at the time, also perished after eating food prepared in the household. Then, in 2017, Alphine's mother, Silly, who had begun to question the pattern of deaths, collapsed and died after a meal at Jolly's house. Each incident was brushed aside as tragic misfortune, But within the extended family, unease grew. 6 deaths in 15 years, all sudden, all unexplained, was too much to ignore. It wasn't until 2019, when suspicions finally boiled over, that the truth came crashing down. Relatives pushed for police intervention, demanding that the deaths be re-examined. Investigators exhumed several bodies, sending shockwaves through the village. Forensic testing revealed traces of cyanide, a deadly poison in multiple victims. It was a revelation that horrified the nation. Jolly Joseph, the woman everyone had trusted, was arrested and accused of orchestrating a string of calculated murders using cyanide to eliminate those who stood between her and her ambitions. During interrogation, Jolly initially denied the charges, insisting she was innocent. But evidence mounted quickly. Witnesses testified about her acquiring cyanide through local contacts, allegedly under the pretense of needing it to control pests. Diaries and financial records showed her increasing control over family assets after each death. Even her academic life was revealed as fraudulent. She had faked college degrees to maintain her image of respectability. The most chilling part of the case was the motive. Unlike many killers driven by rage or passion, Jolly's reasons appeared cold and calculated. Investigators concluded that she wanted financial security, control over the family's property, and the freedom to pursue a relationship with another man. Anyone who posed a threat, whether it was her in-laws, her husband, or relatives who questioned her behavior, became expendable. She eliminated them one by one with methodical precision, hiding behind the facade of a grieving family member. As news of her arrest spread, the community was stunned. Neighbors who had known Jolly for decades struggled to reconcile the quiet woman they saw in church with the cold-blooded murderer described in police reports. The Ponomatum family, once respected, became the center of morbid curiosity, their home a symbol of betrayal and horror. In court, prosecutors painted her as one of the most calculating killers in modern India, a woman who weaponized trust and family bonds to achieve her selfish aims. She showed little visible remorse, maintaining her innocence despite overwhelming evidence. Her calm demeanor during hearings unsettled many, as though she were indifferent to the devastation she had caused. The case is still moving through the Indian legal system, with Jolly facing trial for 6 counts of murder. She remains in prison, her fate hanging between the possibility of life imprisonment or even the death penalty. For the families of her victims, justice is long overdue, but no sentence can erase the scars she has left behind. What makes Jolly Joseph's crimes particularly disturbing is the way she exploited the sanctity of family. Murder within the home carries a unique horror. It strikes at the very foundation of trust. Her victims were not strangers, but people who shared meals, prayers, and celebrations with her. They welcomed her into their lives only to be betrayed in the most intimate and deadly way. Her story forces us to confront the unsettling truth that evil does not always come from the outside. Sometimes it is woven into the very fabric of family life, disguised as love, duty, and care. And sometimes it takes years, decades even, for the mask to slip and the darkness to be revealed. In the quiet streets of Mexico City during the early 2000s, fear began to spread among the elderly. A series of murders baffled police. Older women Many living alone were being found strangled inside their homes. The killer left little evidence behind, only the marks of brutal force and the sense of an intruder who had gained their trust. For months, authorities chased shadows, unable to pin down a suspect. The truth, when it emerged, stunned the nation. The killer was not a man, as many had assumed, but a woman known as Juana Barraza, a former professional wrestler who would become infamous as La Mata Viejitas, the little old lady killer. Born in 1957 in rural Mexico, Juana's life was marked from the start by trauma and instability. Her father abandoned the family when she was a child, and her mother was abusive, often neglecting her daughter's needs. The most devastating betrayal came when her mother reportedly traded her to a man in exchange for a few beers. Juana, just a girl, was subjected to years of sexual abuse, an experience that left deep scars of anger and resentment. She grew up hardened with little education, finding solace only in sports and the world of lucha libre, professional wrestling. In the 1980s and 1990s, she wrestled under the name La Dama del Silencio, the Lady of Silence. In the ring, she donned a mask, performed for crowds, and lived in the fleeting spotlight of Mexico's wrestling culture. But outside the arena, she lived in poverty. A single mother raising children, she struggled to support her family, taking on odd jobs to survive. That combination of poverty, anger at her abusive past, and bitterness toward the elderly women she associated with her mother laid the foundation for her future crimes. The killings began quietly. Elderly women were found dead in their apartments, often strangled with cords, scarves, or even stethoscopes. At first, investigators assumed the killer must be a man, perhaps a burglar targeting vulnerable victims. Police even released sketches based on eyewitness accounts that suggested a tall, muscular man disguised as a woman. For years, this assumption blinded them to the real suspect, who was hiding in plain sight. Juana's method was chillingly effective. She would dress as a social worker or wear clothing that gave her the appearance of an official figure. Gaining entry into homes by offering government assistance or health checks, she exploited the natural trust of elderly women. Once inside, she attacked with brute force, overpowering her victims with strength honed from years in the wrestling ring. Many were strangled, some beaten, and often nothing more than a few valuables were taken, making the crimes appear at first like robberies gone wrong. By the mid-2000s, the pattern was undeniable. More than a dozen elderly women had been killed in similar circumstances. Panic spread across Mexico City. Newspapers screamed headlines about La Mata Viejitas, and elderly residents began to fear opening their doors to strangers. Families urged their mothers and grandmothers not to trust anyone, even those claiming to be social workers. The investigation became one of the largest in Mexico's history, but mistakes plagued the effort. Authorities arrested and released suspects, at one point even detaining trans women and homeless men under suspicion, a move that drew criticism and accusations of scapegoating. Meanwhile, Juana continued her spree, her confidence growing with each murder. It was not until January 2006 that fate intervened. Police responding to a report of a murder spotted a woman leaving the scene. She matched eyewitness descriptions, and when they apprehended her, they found documents and possessions linking her to multiple crime scenes. Her arrest shocked the public, not just because the killer was finally caught, but because she was a woman and a wrestler no less. The image of the masked luchadora who once entertained crowds was forever replaced by that of a cold-blooded killer. During interrogation, Juana confessed to several murders, though she denied others attributed to her. Investigators believed she may have been responsible for as many as 40 victims, though she was ultimately convicted of 16. Her trial in 2008 was a media sensation. Prosecutors painted her as a ruthless predator who targeted the most vulnerable members of society, women who had lived long lives, only to have them cut short by betrayal in their final moments. The defense argued her traumatic past, her abuse, and her poverty played roles in shaping her crimes. But the jury had little sympathy. Juana Barraza was sentenced to 759 years in prison, effectively ensuring she would die behind bars. Even in prison, Juana remained a figure of morbid fascination. Some inmates admired her strength while others feared her. Journalists flocked to her story, dissecting the psychological roots of her violence. Criminologists pointed to her hatred of her mother as a central motive. Her victims became surrogates for the woman who had abandoned and betrayed her. Her case also exposed deep flaws in Mexico's policing, from gender biases to systemic corruption that allowed her to operate for so long. For the families of her victims, the wounds remain open. Elderly women who survived her attempts spoke of the terror of realizing that someone they had welcomed into their homes, believing she came to help, had instead come to kill. The betrayal cut deeper than the violence itself. The story of Juana Barraza lingers as one of the most unsettling reminders of how appearances deceive. A wrestler, a mother, a seemingly ordinary woman, she became a predator whose weapon was trust, whose victims were the vulnerable, and whose legacy will forever haunt Mexico. When people in Romania spoke of kindness, charity, and hospitality, they once pointed to the aristocratic household of Countess Vera Renzi. She was beautiful, charming, and devoted, or so it seemed, but beneath her graceful exterior was an obsessive possessiveness so extreme that it would turn to murder again and again. By the time her story was fully told, Vera would be remembered as one of Europe's most prolific female killers, a woman who poisoned dozens of men, including her own lovers, husbands, and even her child. Vera Renzi was born around 1903 in Bucharest, Romania, to a wealthy family. From her early teenage years, she was described as headstrong, restless, and insatiably jealous. Those who knew her said she was incapable of tolerating neglect. If she loved someone, she demanded their constant attention. If they strayed or even seemed distracted, she burned with suspicion. Her beauty attracted many suitors, and by the time she was 15, she was already engaged in relationships with older men. That hunger for affection, paired with her inability to endure betrayal, would define the course of her life. She married young. Her first husband, reportedly a wealthy businessman. At first, their marriage seemed like a fairy tale, but within a year, he disappeared. Vera explained to acquaintances that he had abandoned her, running off with another woman. Few questioned her story. Not long after, she remarried, this time to a man of similar wealth and standing. Again, tragedy struck. Her second husband also vanished, leaving Vera alone once more. Friends and neighbors pitied her, believing she was cursed by fate to lose those closest to her. But whispers grew louder with each disappearance. The truth was far darker than anyone suspected. Vera had been poisoning her husbands with arsenic, slipping it into their food and drink. Unlike crimes of passion committed in the heat of the moment, hers were calculated, deliberate, and rooted in her obsession with control. If a man she loved paid attention to another woman, if he came home late, if he failed to meet her standards of devotion, she viewed it as betrayal. And betrayal, in Vera's world, was punishable by death. After her husbands, she moved on to lovers. She had many, some fleeting, others longer affairs, but nearly all ended the same way. As soon as she grew jealous or feared abandonment, she lured them into her home, fed them poisoned wine, and watched as they collapsed. Then she disposed of their bodies in the most chilling way imaginable. She placed them in zinc-lined coffins, which she kept locked in the cellar beneath her mansion. To Vera, it wasn't enough to kill. She wanted to keep them near her, imprisoned even in death, as if to ensure they would never leave her side. The macabre collection of coffins grew over time, stacked one after another in the darkness. Each contained the remains of a man who had once promised her love. At one point, even her own son is said to have fallen victim to her jealousy. Some accounts suggest that when he discovered the secret of her cellar and threatened to expose her, she poisoned him as well, sealing him away with the others. Her undoing came not through sudden revelation, but through persistence. One lover vanished after visiting her, and his family demanded answers. Police searched her home, and in the cellar made the gruesome discovery: dozens of coffins, each with a body inside. The sight horrified investigators, and the press soon branded her a monster in human form. Reports at the time claimed as many as 35 men were found, all poisoned by her hand. In court, Vera confessed with chilling calm. She admitted to poisoning her husbands, her lovers, and possibly her child. She explained her motives in cold, matter-of-fact terms. She could not stand the thought of them betraying her, of them loving another. If she couldn't have their undivided devotion, then they would not live at all. To her, murder was simply the means of preserving loyalty forever. She was sentenced to life imprisonment, spending the remainder of her days in a women's prison in Romania. Those who encountered her in custody described her as composed, even genteel, never raising her voice, never seeming remorseful. To the end, she insisted. She acted out of love, as though poisoning dozens of men could somehow be justified as a twisted form of devotion. The story of Vera Renci remains one of the darkest examples of obsessive love turned to horror. Unlike killers driven by greed or rage, hers was a pathology of control, an inability to accept that human beings are free to leave, to falter, to be imperfect. Her victims were men who might have believed they were loved, only to discover too late that her love was a death sentence. Today, her name is remembered less than some of the infamous male serial killers, but her crimes echo with a haunting lesson that evil often cloaks itself in the familiar. Vera was not an outcast or a drifter. She was a respected woman of society, moving through dinner parties and church gatherings, smiling and gracious. All the while, beneath her feet, her cellar filled with coffins, silent, testimony to the lengths she would go to keep love captive. Which of these cases shocked you the most? Let us know in the comments.